It's time to visit more haunted homes again. If you missed my first episode about haunted homes, the link's in the description and at the corner of the screen. I always find it peculiar how we decide to buy or rent a property. When we buy a piece of clothing, for example, we can try it on beforehand, and even after the purchase, can most of times return for a full refund if we are not satisfied with it. But when it comes to choosing where to live, all we can go by is a brief look around the property, even though it's often the biggest financial commitment for most ordinary people, and the choice would fundamentally determine our lifestyle and well-being. We would of course try to make the best rational decision based on what little information available, but we could never really know all the history and things might have happened in those rooms. If walls could talk, eh? So here are 6 allegedly true stories from Korea about haunted homes, as told by the unlucky people who didn't know their new home came with unwanted housemates. As always, handpicked, translated and narrated by your host, Anthony. A friend moved into a new place, so I and another mutual friend visited her and stayed overnight. This friend is notorious for being totally naive to the level of careless. For example, she once confessed she had never bothered locking her door because it was such a hassle to lock and unlock. Fortunately for her, despite of it all, life has not yet burned or bitten her, and she still blindly believes the world is beautiful and people are harmless. Back to a new place. So we went to bed together. As soon as it got silent, we heard a hand clap. I guess it was the friend up to something, so I just said, "Knock it off, this is not a conjuring film." But she denied it was her doing. We all just laughed and talked about the conjuring film. Less than a few minutes later, now the other friend said, "Stop it!" meaning it wasn't the other friend either. Yet another few minutes later, I wondered if it was the next door, but my friend's room being at the end of the floor, there was next door only on the left side, while the clapping was from the right side of the room. All the while this was going on, the owner of the place had already fallen asleep. We shook her up and asked about the ghost clapping. She said, without a care in the world, "That happens occasionally. Something just dropped by itself, but it's really no big deal." And then she turned to fall asleep again. We heard yet another, and on top of that, clothes fell from the hanger. But not wanting to make a fuss, we tried to ignore and sleep. Next morning, we found the door we brought as a gift had moved from the chair onto the table and was looking towards the bedroom. My contacts case, which I had left on the bathroom sink, went missing too. I and the other friend freaked out, but she was just as relaxed as ever. Had the doll moved? Wow, she must have been curious. How cute! We were worried if anything might happen to her, but she lives there carefree to this day. We heard the landlord treats her so well because nobody stayed there long before she moved in. OMG, I can't think why. By the time I married, the house rental market was soaring. It was so difficult to find a place that I even seriously considered if I should go ahead with the wedding. We had to settle down with a flat in a suburb, a remote corner away from the town. But it was cheap, large enough, and brand new. The owner must have bought it as an investment. We are both writers, I for television and films, and my wife pure literature. Naturally, we often stayed and worked home together. The flat didn't let much light in, and the air inside felt at times chillingly dry and other times strangely damp. One day, my wife was away for a night. I was sleeping alone. It was dark in the bedroom, though it wasn't yet too late, about 9 p.m. I felt somebody tapping my cheek with a fingertip. In my sleep I thought, "Is wifey back? What time is it?" Yet another tapping. It was not aggressive nor tickling. I opened my eyes. I could not move, facing a woman bending down over me, her nose almost touching my own. Am I dreaming? I thought. But it wasn't a dream, nor I had a sleep paralysis. I could see the face right in front of me clearly. Those big round eyes looking at me without a blink. She looked barely 20 and could be considered a beauty with beautiful eyes and full lips. I closed my eyes again. I didn't know what to do and could not think straight. I opened my eyes. She was still there, now standing in front of my wife's vanity. She touched and fiddled with wife's scarves, shirts, and other stuffs. Her attitude was more passive-aggressive rather than curious. I could not but watch it all silently. She was taller than the average and was wearing an unflattering simple white long dress on her slender body. Then she slid out of the bedroom. She physically opened the door like a person. I stayed on bed unsure. It wasn't a dream. I turned on the light of the bedroom, but was afraid to follow her out. I could still vividly feel her fingertip on my cheek. I prepared myself and sprinted towards the light switch of the living room. There wasn't a woman anywhere, nor could I find any sign of intrusion. I didn't mention anything to my wife. We had so much trouble finding this place, and we were just settling down. I didn't want to concern her at that stage. But that was just the beginning of weird incidents. As a newlywed couple, we were given a pair of wooden mandarin ducks. It symbolizes a happy marriage, and like most others, we displayed it with their beaks touching together, as if kissing. One morning, wife said, "Those mandarin ducks, you see?" "What about them?" I said. "They are moved apart. I put them beak on beak, and the next morning they are set apart." Indeed, their distance was too wide to be considered to have happened by wind or vibration, as if somebody couldn't stand seeing them lovingly together. My instinct was telling me that it should be that woman I saw, but I couldn't tell my wife. Since the day I checked on the ducks every morning, and they were separated apart every time. And other incidents followed. It was a brand new flat, and our household was also largely new. With just us two, it couldn't get so messy in the flat. Nevertheless, it felt somehow dirty and messy. But then, if I take a closer look to tidy up, there wasn't anything particularly to clean up either. The constant sense of mess started bothering me. Apparently, my wife also commented exactly the same thing about the place. One night, we were sleeping together. Suddenly, an old woman's voice shouted in my right ear. "Get up!" I jumped up. My eardrum popped with so loud a voice. But there was none. My wife was sound asleep. I felt helpless. I started to avoid sleeping in the bedroom. I spent as much time as possible in the library and the living room, but should I ever happen to slip back in the bedroom, the old woman shouted swears right in my ears. I couldn't stand it anymore and told what had been happening to my wife. She was surprisingly calm. I didn't experience them exactly, but have sensed something was off, she said. But as soon as I told her, she also started to see things. One time I was very sick. My gut wrenched violently. I hoped it'd just be some food I ate and sort itself out eventually. My wife kept my side through the agonizing night. Next morning I felt a bit better. Only then wife told me that she had dozed off by my side, only to be woken up by thumping noise. She checked on me and saw a young woman jumping on my belly as if I were her trampoline. She jumped up so enthusiastically and so high, her head hit the ceiling, making the thumping noise she heard. My wife was shocked, but fearing whatever worse the woman might do had she noticed my wife was watching, she tried to keep calm. Wife's description of the woman matched the one I saw. That was really enough. We decided to move out as soon as possible. Meanwhile, we flipped our night and day. We slept during the day and stayed awake working or playing at nights. My wife's family is Catholic. About a couple of times a month, I joined my wife and her family to Sunday Mass. We happened to talk with a new young priest to the diocese. Upon hearing our trouble, he was sympathetic and gave us a pair of consecrated rosaries, saying they might help to keep the peace of our minds. We had rosaries on ourselves at all times, and surprisingly they did work. The ghosts didn't harm or touch us directly anymore. If we slept in the bedroom, they might rattle dishes and pans in the kitchen, shake up the curtains in the living room, etc., but didn't come into our bedroom. Having deprived of sleep so long, we were happy enough and slept like babies despite of all the noises outside the room. Meanwhile, I happened to get work for a television series. I had to attend a meeting almost every day. Since our flat was not very well connected to the central town, I had to drive back and forth. One early morning, I was driving to work, and on the rearview mirror saw an old woman sitting at the back. It must be the same old woman who shouted in my ears. She was looking outside, grumpily mumbling something endlessly. I got suddenly so angry and shouted, "What the heck are you doing now in my car? Stop it now or I'll get some people in." "I won't stop. For as long as you live in the flat, I'll keep grating you," she talked back. I don't know how I drove the rest of the journey. She disappeared before I arrived at work. And true to her word, she appeared in my journey whenever I had to drive early in the dawn or late at night. From what I heard, her mumbles were complaints about how poorly she was treated like some beggar and so on. But I didn't have slightest idea who she was and why she should complain that to me. Unfortunately, we had to live the full contract period of 2 years and more in the flat. We were both going mad. My wife suffered hearing impairment due to the constant noises and shouts. And I, with all the work and finance-related troubles at the time on top of ghosts at home, suffered depression. I almost contemplated to end it all, but thanks to my wife's care, I passed the dangerous point. But in the end, we managed to move out and into a new place. God, I can't forget what I felt when we moved into the current flat. The sense of comfort and safety embracing me. It is bright with lots of sun flooding in during the day, and we sleep like dead, undisturbed all night here. Thank God. About a year later, we got a call from the new tenant to our old flat. She asked if we had a contact information to the landlord, as she could not reach them via the number she had. Apparently, she wanted to move out. My wife tactfully asked why, and she said, "This flat is haunted." It's a story my PE teacher told once, when one day the PE class had to be withdrawn indoors due to a heavy shower. The teacher was female, but was taller than an average man and with a superb bone structure that could easily crush any guy. The story was from before she became a teacher. She was then looking for a cheap room after failing the National Teacher's Certificate test for the third time. She came across an unusually cheap offer. On the surface, there seemed no reason for the price, its size, location, and all. She suspected there should be some other reason, perhaps a high crime rate in the area. But being a stronger and bigger than any normal guy herself, she took the room without too much worries. And in that new room, she suffered regular sleep paralysis at least once in 3 days. She would see during the paralysis episodes 2 ghostly figures of a young woman and a little girl. They would appear together sometimes, and other times one at a time. Regardless, they played around her loudly, disturbing her sleep. The little girl would bounce a ball around her, and the woman would crouch down on her side and pull her hairs. My teacher was a bit frightened at first, but soon she decided to make the best of the situation and studied through the night when such should occur again. By the time the next test day was near, she turned bony and felt for the first time in her life physically worn out. A few days before the big test, both ghosts appeared. For once, they neither bounced the ball around nor pulled her hairs, but sat quietly by her side. Then the woman gently pat on my teacher's head and said, "You've endured a lot. Wait for a good news." Then they disappeared with a smile. That was the last time she saw them, and indeed she passed a certificate test this time. By now, she said, she felt somewhat grateful to them despite of all the hard nights she had to suffer. I went to university far from home, so found a very cheap flat in the 40 or older building, which is very old by Korean standard, and shared it with a cousin who then worked in the area. One day I came back late from a party with colleagues and fell straight onto bed. About 4 in the morning, I woke up by loud footsteps ringing from the corridor outside. It was fast too, almost running steps. On my floor were only elderly residents apart from me and my cousin, and none of them could have walked so fast up and down. As I listened on wondering, I noticed a shadow appearing outside the window facing the corridor. It was a head floating just above the high window. I was so shocked that I think I fainted. I wanted to believe it was just alcohol having played a trick on me. But from the day on, the same rushing steps returned every night about 4 in the morning. I even asked the security to check the surveillance camera, but nothing unusual was found. One morning, I was idling around because there was no lecture. On my way out to buy a cigarette, an old lady from the neighbor stopped me and asked me an unexpected question. "Don't you see something odd in that flat?" By then I was struggling with sleepless nights for weeks on, so I told her straight out with what I'd been experiencing. Then the old lady told me the history of the flat. About 20 years ago, a young couple lived there. The husband had an affair with a woman in the neighborhood. The heartbroken wife hung herself from the gas pipeline running along the corridor. The unfaithful husband later married his lover, but he got paranoid about his new wife's fidelity and ended up killing her and himself. Since then on, none seemed to be able to live in that flat longer than 2 years, clearly drained mentally and physically by the time they moved out. No wonder it was on offer for such a cheap rent. I and my cousin, of course, moved out soon after. It was scary and disturbing while I lived there, but I pray that the soul of the poor lady may finally find her peace sometime. My childhood home was a shabby hut built on the plot of what used to be a communal well. It was more like a house of cards made with plywood as walls and corrugated asbestos sheet as roof. Still, it was my home, and I lived there with my older sister, grandma, and a relative. The relative took one room and grandma and us the other. When we first moved there, I guess it was when I was 3 or so, I noticed there was a strange piece of yellow paper with red scribbles on above every door in the house. I asked Grandma what they were, but she simply told me they were nothing. Only later I learned they were talismans of sorts. I think it was one day shortly after I started school, I saw the talisman above our room door half falling off. Nobody in the family seemed to care for the talisman all the while, so I just took it off, crumpled it up, and threw away. Indeed, nobody even noticed that it wasn't there anymore. But then, my sister started complaining about suffering sleep paralysis night after night. She'd say some black figure with a long black hair would push down on her arms. She could not see any other features of the shadow figure's face, but its glaring yellow of eyes. She could not move nor avoid the glaring. And just about the same time, I started wetting bed frequently at the age of 7. One summer night, I went to bed early, having come down with a cold on top of it all. I don't know how long I had slept, but when I woke up, I could not move, feeling my body all limp and weighty. It was clearly late night, and Grandma and sister were sleeping next to me. Strangely, the light was still left on in the room. Suddenly, a woman in white emerged from the floor, flew over me, and stood on me with her feet pressing down the each side of my shoulders. It made me hard to breathe, and she looked down to watch me struggle. Her face was completely obscured by her long black hair, but I could nevertheless sense her eyes staring behind a curtain of hair. I was more confused than scared. I struggled to move away, which clearly amused the woman. She giggled and started dancing and jumping on me. Every time her foot landed on my chest, I felt like my heart bursting out. When I felt I could not take it anymore, my grandma woke up, and with that, the woman faded away. I could feel my pulse slowing down as soon as I could move again. I jumped in her arms and explained what I just saw. Grandma didn't say anything but sighed deeply and looked to the direction of the door. She seemed surprised to find the talisman gone and asked me if I knew where it went. But I denied any knowledge of it, fearing getting reprimanded. A few days later, Grandma brought in a Buddhist monk. He chanted to the rhythm of the wooden block and took out the talisman off of his sleeve to put it where the old one used to be. Maybe it was all but a coincidence, but since then, my sister didn't get sleep paralysis, and I didn't wet bed anymore either. Now the house is long gone, and the plot has turned into a public trail for hiking route, but I still occasionally think about who that woman was. Could it have been something to do with the old well which used to be there? A story a friend told me, which he said he himself heard from a friend. So, make what you will. There lived an old man who was notorious among his neighbors for being mean and stingy. For all his greed, he seemed to have accumulated certain wealth, but lived by himself. An all-around Mr. Scrooge character. So let's call him Mr. Scrooge here. Why not? The rumor went that he lost his wife and kids from a tragic accident, but nobody was close enough to know the truth. The only friend-ish figure to him was a local real estate dealer. One day our Mr. Scrooge went to visit his office, and from the usual chit-chat with him, got to learn that there was a house rumored to be haunted. Of course, nobody wanted the property. Even with the price plummeting, it remained the real estate dealer's headache for months. To his friend's surprise, Mr. Scrooge offered to buy the house. The dealer was reluctant. Considering Mr. Scrooge's character, if things should really go bad with the house, he'd have to deal with Scrooge's temper and complaints. But Mr. Scrooge insisted upon the deal, promising that he was not going to hold him accountable whatever the consequence. Soon the rumor that Mr. Scrooge bought the haunted house was talk of the neighbors. What was he up to? What should happen if the house was really haunted? Regardless, Mr. Scrooge refurbished and redecorated the house, and to everybody's surprise, he started sleeping in that house. He would still spend the day in his own home, but came to his new property to sleep every night. The next-door neighbors reported that they could hear Scrooge yelling and huffing, but nobody dared to ask him straight what was going on. A month passed. Mr. Scrooge turned up at the real estate dealer's office. He claimed the house was haunted no more and would like to put it up for rent. The dealer wasn't sure, but did as was told. Soon a family moved into a house. Everybody in the neighborhood held their breath and waited what should happen now. Nothing. The family seemed to settling well in the new place and living on without an issue. In that house where no owners or tenants had managed to stay put more than a month previously, people could not hold their curiosity anymore and asked Mr. Scrooge what he did in the house. What was all the yelling there? Mr. Scrooge explained that for that 1 month, he walked room to room every night and shouted, "Pay the rent! This house is not for free! Pay up the rent!" He never saw a ghost, nor he believed in such. But since the rumor was rampant the place being haunted, he just carried on with his nightly ritual. And one day, he had a dream in which somebody shouted back at him saying,
"Shut up! This house is mine!"
Right from the following day, Mr. Scrooge went room to room, shouting, "This is not your house! I bought it! It's mine!" He even brought the contract of the purchase with him. He waved it around and carried on shouting, "Look at this! Here's my name and signature! Now, pay the rent!" It carried on a few days before he got another dream. The same voice from the earlier dream shouted,
"All right, it's yours, not mine!"
Mr. Scrooge took it the issue being settled and put the house for rent. Nobody could prove what he said was true or not. All they could tell was they never heard another complaint about a ghost from the family or any other subsequent tenants to the house. Hi, it's Anthony here, and thank you very much for your listening. Hope you enjoyed today's stories. I currently live in an old house, and by fact I know at least 4 or more different families lived here before me. I'm sure these walls then would have seen lots of things, possibly even death. But fortunately I haven't yet seen anything weird so far, except for cobwebs and cracks everywhere on the walls and ceilings. If you enjoyed my video, please give it a like, leave me a comment, and share it with your friends. If you really liked it, also consider subscribing to my channel and watch my past episodes too. I'll come back next week. Until then, stay safe and take care.